A 15-year-old black teenager stands alone in court, courageously taking on a justice system riddled with prejudice and corruption. Can one boy's bravery and intellect really challenge decades of injustice? What would you do if justice rested on the shoulders of a single determined teenager? Stay with me and experience this emotional and gripping journey, because sometimes the truth is strongest when spoken by the youngest voices. Now, our story begins in a tense courtroom where everything is about to change. The air in the small courthouse outside thick with tension, heavy enough that you could almost feel it pressing against your chest. The murmurs of the gathered audience faded into silence as all eyes shifted forward, settling on a single figure standing alone before the judge, a slender, 15-year-old black teenager named Elijah Carter. Elijah stood tall, though his hands trembled slightly as he held them tightly at his sides. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, determined not to show any weakness, even as he sensed the room's judgment heavy upon him. He knew why he was here, and more painfully, he knew why they assumed he was guilty. The color of his skin was louder than his truth, his innocence overshadowed by the silent prejudice hanging in the air. Judge Evelyn Monroe, a middle-aged white woman with graying hair neatly pulled back into a severe bun, peered down at him through thin-rimmed glasses. Her voice cut sharply through the silence, authoritative and detached. Elijah Carter, based on the testimony provided by Officer Mason, you're charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Considering the circumstances, I am sentencing you to pay a fine of $500 and complete 50 hours of community service. Do you have anything to say before I finalize this ruling? A quiet ripple of indifference ran through the spectators, as though Elijah's guilt was predetermined, a foregone conclusion they'd witnessed too many times before. Yet, amidst the whispers and shifting seats, Elijah slowly lifted his head. His eyes, dark and resolute, met the judge's directly. "Yes, Your Honor, I do," he said, his voice clear and unexpectedly steady. "I respectfully object to your ruling. I would like to represent myself in this hearing and prove my innocence." A stunned silence fell across the courtroom, broken only by the soft gasp of an older woman in the back and the quick shifting of Officer Mason, who now leaned forward, visibly unsettled. Judge Monroe paused, removing her glasses and carefully regarding the boy before her. "Young man," she said, her tone firm yet tinged with surprise, "this is not some classroom exercise. Do you fully understand what you're saying?" Elijah took a deep, calming breath. The weight of countless sleepless nights spent studying law books and court transcripts steadied him. With quiet strength he replied, "Yes, ma'am, I know exactly what I'm saying. I didn't do what Officer Mason has accused me of. I may just be 15, but justice isn't about age or race, it's about truth. And today, if you'll let me, I intend to prove that truth." His words echoed powerfully, resonating throughout the small courtroom and forcing every person there to truly see him, not as a suspect, not as just another statistic, but as a young man determined to claim his dignity and rights. Officer Mason shifted uneasily in his seat, his jaw tightening in irritation. The spectators exchanged bewildered looks, sensing that this trial might become more than a simple verdict. It might become a test of fairness itself. Could this 15-year-old boy truly stand against a system deeply rooted in prejudice? Or was his brave declaration nothing more than a young man's hopeful, impossible dream? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. The courtroom drama had just begun, and Elijah Carter was about to risk everything for justice. To truly understand Elijah Carter, you first have to know about the small house on Linden Avenue, tucked away in one of Atlanta's forgotten neighborhoods. It wasn't much to look at, just a modest wooden structure, its faded blue paint peeling from years of neglect. But inside those walls, love and resilience lived in abundance, shaped by the quiet strength of Elijah's grandmother, Ruth. Ruth Carter was a woman whose gentle smile often hid a lifetime of struggle. She had eyes that sparkled even on weary days, and hands worn from decades of hard work. Hands that still rose early every morning to knead dough and bake bread to sell at the local market. After Elijah's parents disappeared without a trace when he was barely 6, Grandma Ruth became his entire world, the lighthouse guiding him through life's stormy seas. Elijah often thought about his parents, especially late at night, when sleep evaded him. He'd stare at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering why they left, if they truly had left, or if something darker had happened to them. The unanswered questions formed an emptiness inside him, a quiet ache he kept hidden from everyone except Ruth. Whenever those thoughts overwhelmed him, he'd feel Grandma Ruth's gentle hand rest softly on his shoulder, her voice whispering the familiar reassurance. "Baby, your parents loved you. Whatever happened, it ain't got nothing to do with you. You carry their dreams forward, hear me?" And Elijah did hear her, loud and clear. He carried their dreams forward by diving deep into his schoolwork, surprising even himself with how effortlessly he could recall information, whether it was historical dates, mathematical formulas, or pages upon pages of complicated legal textbooks. But his talent, as impressive as it was, often proved isolating. At school, Elijah faced suspicion and resentment from peers and even some teachers. His quick mind and thoughtful questions were often mistaken for arrogance, his quiet determination misinterpreted as defiance. He quickly learned that being exceptional wasn't always seen as admirable, especially for a young black teenager in a school where expectations ran low and biases ran deep. He remembered the sting of overheard whispers clearly. Who does he think he is anyway? Just another smart-mouthed kid from the wrong side of town. Kids like him don't go far. Those voices, sharp as daggers, had once made Elijah doubt himself, wondering if perhaps he should hide his intellect, lower his head, blend into the shadows. But each time that uncertainty crept in, Grandma Ruth's steady voice pulled him back. "Never dim your light, Elijah," she'd tell him, her words firm yet gentle. "The world may not be ready for you, but you be ready for the world. Change comes slow, but it comes, and sometimes all it needs is one brave soul willing to speak." And so Elijah made a silent promise to himself, to rise above the shadows of prejudice, not with anger, but with dignity, kindness, and the sharp clarity of truth. He studied relentlessly, devouring law books and legal cases, determined that one day he would use his knowledge to defend those who had no voice, just as he himself had felt silenced. Yet, as he stood alone in that courtroom now, facing accusations born from the same prejudices that had haunted him all his life, Elijah couldn't help but feel the heavy weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders once more. Doubt whispered to him again, taunting him with the same old question. Was he strong enough, brave enough to fight back? He closed his eyes briefly, picturing Grandma Ruth's reassuring face, the comforting warmth of freshly baked bread filling the tiny kitchen of their small house. He could hear her voice clearly, full of unwavering faith. "You're stronger than you know, Elijah. Don't ever let them define who you are." Elijah opened his eyes once more, his gaze steady and resolved. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, that he was about to step into the biggest battle of his life, but he wouldn't back down. He was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for Grandma Ruth, for his missing parents, and for every young person like him who had been told that justice was not theirs to claim. And as he lifted his chin to face Judge Monroe and the crowded courtroom, Elijah Carter knew exactly what he needed to do next. The truth, after all, had chosen him, and he was ready. It had been a long day, and the sun was already slipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet. Elijah pedaled his worn-out bicycle down the quiet street, a backpack filled with heavy books weighing him down, but his spirits high with thoughts of Grandma Ruth's comforting smile and warm dinner waiting at home. The crisp air rushed past him, and for a brief moment, he felt free. Free from judgment, free from prejudice. But that freedom was shattered in an instant by the shrill sound of a police siren behind him. Elijah's heart sank as he slowed his bike to a stop, pulling over carefully to the curb. His hands felt suddenly cold, despite the warmth lingering in the evening air. He turned slowly to see Officer Mason, a tall, imposing figure in uniform, known locally for his harsh demeanor, stepping out of his patrol car, eyes narrowed, scanning Elijah suspiciously. "Where are you rushing off to so fast, boy?" Officer Mason asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Elijah swallowed, feeling the familiar sting of that word. Boy, a word that somehow felt designed to remind him of his place. Still, he maintained a calm, respectful tone. "Just headed home, sir. I wasn't rushing, just riding my bike." Officer Mason approached slowly, his hand resting near his belt. Elijah's pulse quickened, a whisper of fear slipping through his defenses. He forced himself to remain still, meeting the officer's gaze without aggression. "Seems to me you were riding recklessly. I saw you weaving through traffic back there." Elijah's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "I wasn't weaving, sir. The street is empty. I didn't break any rules." Mason leaned closer, his voice lowering to a harsh whisper. "You getting smart with me, son? Don't think for a second I don't know your type. Trouble follows you people everywhere you go." Those words struck Elijah's heart like an icy blade. His type, you people. Anger and frustration flared inside him, but Elijah held tight to Grandma Ruth's gentle wisdom. He knew this battle wouldn't be won by raising his voice, but by using his mind and his courage. So he steadied his breathing, his voice quiet but firm. "Officer, I haven't broken any laws. I was simply riding home." Officer Mason's jaw tightened, his eyes cold with authority. Without hesitation, he reached for his citation pad, scribbling quickly and roughly, tearing off a sheet of paper. "Disorderly conduct and resisting an officer. I suggest you learn some respect," Mason said dismissively, handing Elijah the ticket. Elijah stared down at the unjust words scribbled hastily across the paper. His heart felt heavy, tears of frustration threatening behind his eyes. But at that moment, amid the painful humiliation, something sparked deep within his spirit. A fierce determination, born from years of silent struggle and quiet strength. He raised his head slowly, meeting Officer Mason's eyes with an unwavering resolve. "This isn't right," Elijah said calmly, courage clear in every word. "Tell it to the judge," Mason sneered, turning abruptly and returning to his car. As the patrol car sped away, Elijah stood alone on the darkening street, ticket still crumpled in his fist, his bike lying abandoned at his side. The unfairness, the helplessness, it was a feeling he knew too well. But this time was different. This time, he wouldn't simply accept it. That night, beneath the soft glow of a single desk lamp, Elijah spread law books, legal notes, and court transcripts across his tiny bedroom table. He read with intensity, eyes tracing each line, absorbing every detail. His mind raced, fueled by the urgency of justice and dignity. For hours, he sat in quiet defiance, crafting his defense, preparing not just for himself, but for every other person who had ever stood silenced in the shadow of injustice. Near dawn, Elijah paused, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. He closed the books and rested his head in his hands, whispering a promise softly into the quiet darkness. "No matter how hard they try to silence me, I'll speak louder. No matter how many times they push me down, I'll rise higher. I won't let prejudice decide who I am or what I can become." As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, Elijah knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, he would face his destiny not with anger or fear, but with courage, truth, and an unwavering belief that one voice, no matter how young, no matter how quiet, can ignite the powerful flame of justice. The courtroom felt heavier than ever, the tension palpable like an approaching storm. Elijah stood behind the defendant's table, alone yet unbroken. The eyes fixed on him carried skepticism, doubt, even subtle hostility. But today he wasn't intimidated. Today, Elijah Carter was ready. Judge Evelyn Monroe cleared her throat, breaking the uneasy silence. "Mr. Carter, you requested to represent yourself. Very well. Please present your defense." Elijah took a slow, steady breath and stepped forward, holding a carefully prepared document. His voice began quietly, but gained strength as he spoke, clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, Officer Mason accused me of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. However, according to the local traffic ordinance, bicyclists have the right of way when no immediate traffic is present, and I was fully compliant with this rule. Additionally, Officer Mason claims I resisted him, but resisting requires intent, and respectfully questioning the grounds for being stopped does not constitute resistance." He paused briefly, letting his words sink in. The courtroom's whispers quieted, replaced by curiosity. Elijah continued firmly. "In fact, I have with me evidence from the city's own surveillance cameras, obtained legally through a public records request, showing exactly what happened. The footage confirms I neither violated any traffic laws nor posed any threat to Officer Mason." Elijah handed the papers to the clerk. Judge Monroe accepted them, flipping through with visible astonishment. For the first time, her usually firm expression softened, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Officer Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the confident smirk fading from his lips. "You obtained all this yourself?" Judge Monroe asked quietly, eyebrows raised. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah responded, his eyes locked firmly on hers. "Justice shouldn't be about race or age. It should be about truth and fairness. And today, that's all I ask of this court, fairness." A hush settled over the courtroom. The silence felt empowering, charged by Elijah's simple yet powerful words. He stood straight, feeling for the first time as though he was truly seen. Then, abruptly, the courtroom doors swung open with a startling noise, shattering the momentary calm. All heads turned simultaneously toward the entrance, where a woman stood silhouetted against the bright hallway lights. She hesitated momentarily, then stepped into the courtroom, revealing a face Elijah instantly recognized, yet could scarcely believe was real. His breath caught painfully in his chest. "Mom?" Elijah's voice emerged barely more than a whisper, raw with disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Sarah Carter stood frozen, her dark eyes searching Elijah's face with an intense, painful longing. The years had etched lines of sorrow and hardship onto her once youthful features. Her gaze brimmed with unshed tears. "Elijah," she finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "My God, how you've grown." Confusion, relief, anger, joy, emotions collided within Elijah's heart in a chaotic storm. How many nights had he lain awake, yearning for answers, aching with questions that haunted him about her disappearance? How many silent conversations had he whispered in the dark, pleading for reasons, explanations? "Order, please, order in this courtroom," Judge Monroe demanded, banging her gavel sharply. But the turmoil in Elijah's heart drowned out everything else. "You left," Elijah murmured, his voice choked with pain. "I thought you were dead. Grandma thought you were dead. Why now, Mom? Why here?" Sarah took a hesitant step forward, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Her voice carried the weight of unbearable regret. "I never wanted to leave you, Elijah. They made me disappear. I had no choice. But when I heard what happened, I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I had to find you, had to tell you the truth." Elijah's body shook with conflicting emotions. Part of him longed to rush into her arms, reclaiming years lost. Another part, hardened by grief and abandonment, wanted to turn away. But as he searched his mother's eyes, he recognized a shared pain, one born from injustice, prejudice, and suffering. Judge Monroe's stern voice interrupted again. "Given these unexpected circumstances, this court will take a brief recess. Mr. Carter, you and your mother have 15 minutes to speak privately." As the courtroom emptied, Elijah slowly approached Sarah, each step heavy with memories and unanswered questions. When they stood close, he felt suddenly like a child again, vulnerable, exposed. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Elijah whispered, voice cracking with years of hurt. Sarah reached out gently, touching his cheek softly, as if afraid he might vanish. "I promise, Elijah, I never abandoned you willingly. Powerful people forced me away, threatened to harm you and Grandma if I tried returning. But now, seeing your courage, seeing you standing up for justice like this, I couldn't hide any longer." He closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the bittersweet truth. She was here, alive, yet the pain of her absence still echoed in his heart. Could he trust again? Could he forgive? "I don't expect you to forgive me," Sarah continued softly. "But I came here today because I need you to know something important. This case, your arrest, it's no accident. The people who forced me into hiding are behind it. They feared your voice, Elijah. They feared your strength. They wanted to silence you." Elijah's breath quickened, anger and determination reigniting fiercely inside him. His struggle was now bigger than himself, bigger even than he'd imagined. It wasn't simply about proving his innocence. It was about dismantling an invisible force of injustice that threatened to destroy lives, just as it had nearly destroyed his family. Sarah held his hands gently, her gaze unwavering. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. Let me stand by your side." Elijah took a deep breath, feeling something powerful stir inside. Hope. For the first time in years, he saw clearly what he was fighting for. Not just his own freedom, but the freedom of others silenced by prejudice and oppression. He would use his voice to speak truth, justice, and compassion, and nothing would hold him back. As the courtroom doors opened once more, signaling the end of the recess, Elijah straightened his shoulders, turning back toward the judge. He was no longer afraid. He would face whatever storm awaited with renewed courage, knowing finally that he wasn't alone. Because sometimes the greatest truths rise out of the deepest pain, and Elijah Carter was ready to speak louder than ever. In the quiet side room adjacent to the courtroom, Elijah sat across from his mother, Sarah. The world outside seemed distant and muted, replaced by a powerful tension that filled the space between them. Sarah reached out tentatively, gently grasping her son's trembling hands, her eyes filled with unshed tears, reflecting years of pain and hidden truths. "Elijah, there's so much you don't know," Sarah began softly, her voice breaking slightly as she struggled to maintain composure. "All these years, I wished I could be there for you, holding you, watching you grow, protecting you. But the people who took me away, they're powerful and dangerous." "Who are they, Mom?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. "Who could possibly be powerful enough to separate us, to make us suffer like this?" Sarah took a deep, steadying breath, her eyes filled with regretful shadows. "They call themselves the Alliance. It's a secretive, influential group, powerful individuals hidden within positions of authority, manipulating justice behind the scenes. Their goal isn't truth, Elijah, it's control. Control of the courts, the police, and the entire justice system." She paused, eyes darkening with memories that haunted her. "Years ago, I was working as a journalist investigating cases of wrongful convictions, innocent people, primarily minorities, targeted unjustly. The deeper I got, the clearer it became that these injustices weren't random. They were orchestrated, carefully hidden, meticulously executed. When the Alliance realized how close I was to exposing them, they framed me, threatened my life, and yours, Elijah." Her voice faltered, choking back a sob. "They forced me into hiding. The only way to protect you and your grandmother was to disappear. I lived in fear every day, knowing if I contacted you, I'd be putting your life in danger. But seeing you here, bravely standing up against injustice, I couldn't hide anymore. You're stronger than they realize." Elijah felt as though a veil had suddenly been torn from his eyes, revealing the true scale of the darkness he faced. It wasn't just Officer Mason's prejudice or even Judge Monroe's cold detachment. There was something much deeper, something darker, silently controlling the strings of injustice. And now, his mother's words echoed hauntingly in his mind, revealing a fight far bigger than he'd ever imagined. "This whole time," Elijah whispered bitterly, anger and sorrow intertwining in his heart, "all these innocent people were silenced, punished for crimes they didn't commit. And no one knew, no one spoke up." Sarah nodded slowly, sadness etched deeply into her features. "Fear kept people quiet. The Alliance thrives on silence and submission. But Elijah, your courage has become a threat to them. They tried to silence you precisely because they sensed your strength. They're afraid, not just of your intellect, but of your voice, the voice that could awaken others." Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing in deeply. Images flashed through his mind, the unjust accusations, the humiliation on the street, Grandma Ruth's comforting hands, and now his mother's shattered life. Each fragment strengthened his resolve, forging his heart with newfound determination. When he opened his eyes again, the fire in his gaze was unmistakable. "This isn't just about my innocence anymore, is it?" he asked quietly, looking deeply into his mother's eyes. "It's about bringing down an entire system built on lies, oppression, and hatred. It's about exposing the truth, no matter how painful." Sarah nodded solemnly, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "It won't be easy. They'll fight back harder now. But I know you, Elijah. You're brave enough. You're exactly the voice this world needs." For the first time, Elijah felt the full weight of responsibility settle upon him. A burden, yes, but also a purpose greater than himself. He could see it clearly now. His struggle wasn't singular. He stood for countless others whose names would never be known, whose cries went unheard. He stood for justice itself. "I won't run from this," Elijah promised fiercely, gripping his mother's hands with newfound strength. "I won't let their threats stop me. If they think they can intimidate us into silence, they're wrong." In that quiet moment, mother and son shared an understanding deeper than words, the quiet bond between two souls reunited and resolute against the storm ahead. Elijah knew the path before him would be filled with danger, sacrifice, and pain. But he also knew it would lead to truth, justice, and finally freedom. The courtroom door opened softly, signaling their time had ended. As Elijah stood, facing once more toward the daunting unknown, he felt stronger than ever before. He had found his purpose, an unbreakable resolve born from love, pain, and truth. He glanced at his mother one final time before stepping back into the courtroom. Her quiet words followed him like an unbreakable promise. "You're not alone, Elijah. We're stronger than the fear they create, and together we will show the world that truth cannot be silenced." With his head held high, Elijah Carter stepped forward, ready to face the next chapter of a battle no longer only his own. A fight not just for himself, but for his family, for justice, and for every voice ever lost in silence. For Elijah, the truth had finally been unveiled, and he would carry it forward with courage, no matter what lay ahead. After leaving the courtroom, Elijah's mind raced with heavy questions and an even heavier determination. He wandered out into the courthouse garden, seeking fresh air to calm the storm within. As he stood quietly beneath an old oak tree, the gentle rustling of leaves offered a brief moment of peace. Yet he knew the calm wouldn't last. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence behind him. "You're brave, Elijah Carter. Braver than anyone I've known." Startled, Elijah turned swiftly, meeting the earnest eyes of a young woman standing quietly in the shadows. She stepped forward cautiously, her short auburn hair catching the sunlight, her eyes filled with compassion and strength. "My name is Emma Davis," she introduced herself softly. "I've been waiting to talk to you." Suspicion flashed across Elijah's face. After everything he'd faced, trust felt dangerous. Yet something sincere in Emma's gentle expression disarmed him. She sensed his hesitation and raised her hands gently, signaling peace. "I know about the alliance," she whispered carefully, her eyes scanning their surroundings nervously. "I used to work for them. But I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Not after what I saw." Elijah's heart quickened with a blend of hope and wariness. Could he trust her? Was this another trap, or had fate truly brought him an ally? "Why should I believe you?" Elijah asked softly, his voice tight with uncertainty. Emma took a cautious step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper filled with raw honesty. "Because I know the things they've done, Elijah, the people they've hurt, the innocent lives destroyed. At first, I thought I was working for justice, helping the system stay fair. But when I discovered their true intentions, I was terrified. I ran. Now they're hunting me too." Her voice shook slightly, revealing vulnerability beneath her brave exterior. Elijah watched her carefully, recognizing a kindred spirit, a young woman scarred by secrets, haunted by truths she could no longer keep hidden. "Why come to me?" Elijah asked cautiously. Emma looked directly into his eyes, her expression fiercely determined. "Because you're the first one who stood up to them openly. You did something no one else dared. Elijah, you're their greatest fear, but you can't fight them alone, and neither can I." Elijah's gaze softened as he saw the sincerity, the raw courage reflected in her eyes. His heart urged him to trust, to believe in the power of unity. Slowly, he extended his hand. Emma hesitated for just a heartbeat before grasping it firmly, sealing their alliance. From that moment, Elijah and Emma became inseparable allies. Nights turned into days as they tirelessly pursued leads, dug into old files, and pieced together evidence that could dismantle the alliance once and for all. They worked hidden in shadows, whispering truths no one else dared speak, knowing each step deeper into darkness brought greater risks. Elijah discovered in Emma not just a partner but a true friend, someone who understood his pain, fears, and dreams. Together, they found strength neither knew they had. Yet the closer they came to unraveling the alliance, the more relentless the threats became. Late one night, as they sifted through stacks of confidential documents in Emma's modest apartment, Elijah paused, exhaustion evident in his tired eyes. "Emma, aren't you afraid?" he asked softly, the quiet honesty in his voice revealing his own hidden fears. She glanced up, studying him carefully, then answered truthfully, her voice soft yet resolute. "Of course I am. Terrified, actually. But my fear of living in silence, of letting them control us, that's far worse. We're fighting for something bigger than fear." Elijah nodded slowly, deeply moved by her courage. He realized then, their fight was no longer just for themselves. It was for every innocent life silenced by prejudice, every person unjustly condemned, every victim who could no longer speak for themselves. And in that moment of profound clarity, Elijah knew his journey was exactly where it was meant to be. This battle had chosen him, not because he was special, but because he refused to surrender to injustice. Together, he and Emma would show the world the power of truth and friendship. As the first glow of dawn crept through the window, Elijah turned to Emma, determination clear in his voice. No matter how dangerous it gets, we'll face it together. We'll bring the truth to light, no matter what it takes. Emma smiled gently, her eyes reflecting quiet strength and unwavering resolve. Together, she echoed firmly. Until the very end. In the quiet space between them, an unspoken promise hung powerfully. A bond of courage, unity, and hope that would endure whatever darkness awaited. Elijah knew their path forward would test them fiercely. But now, with Emma by his side, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought alone. They're fought with allies, friends who stand beside us, sharing our pain, courage, and dreams. Together, Elijah and Emma stepped bravely into the uncertainty ahead, ready to fight for justice, dignity, and the truth they refused to let be silenced. The knock came just before dawn. Elijah had barely slept. His mind was tangled with timelines, evidence charts, and the invisible hands of the Alliance pressing closer every day. He sat hunched over a table littered with files when the sharp rapping on the door shattered the silence. Emma rushed to the window. Her face went pale. "It's a delivery driver, but he's wearing a suit," she whispered. Cautiously, Elijah opened the door. No one was there, just a plain white envelope lying on the ground. Inside was a photo. It showed Grandma Ruth, bound to a chair, eyes wide but calm, lips taped. The background was unfamiliar, a darkened warehouse lit by a single overhead bulb. Scrawled in thick red marker across the bottom were 4 chilling words: "Stop or she dies." Elijah's heart dropped into his stomach. The air around him felt thin, like the world had been sucked into a vacuum. His breath caught, his body frozen. Emma grabbed his shoulder as he stared at the photo, shaking his head in disbelief. "No," he muttered. "No, not her, not Grandma." A second note was tucked behind the photo. It was typed, cold, emotionless. "Walk away. Burn everything. Stay silent. You have 48 hours. The paper trembled in Elijah's hands. His vision blurred. The warmth of the room disappeared, replaced by a suffocating chill. He turned to Emma, his voice barely a whisper. "They took her. They took the only person I have left." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "They know you're close. They're trying to break you." He sank into the chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a crushing tide. For the first time since this journey began, Elijah felt lost, truly, utterly lost. All his life, it had been him and Grandma Ruth. She had raised him, believed in him, protected him with quiet strength, and now she was the one in danger because of him. "What do I do?" he asked hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of grief and rage. "How do I choose between justice and the woman who saved my life?" The silence was unbearable. Then Elijah's phone buzzed. A video file appeared. No sender, no title. Hands shaking, he opened it. It was Grandma Ruth. She was still in that same dark room, but her eyes stared directly into the camera, filled with unshakable love and fire. "Elijah," her voice came through, warm and steady despite the fear around her. "Baby, if you're seeing this, they want to make you choose. But listen to me. Don't let them win." She paused, breath catching. "You were born to fight this fight. I always knew it. You're stronger than they ever expected. They're afraid of you, Elijah, and that means you're doing something right." Tears rolled down Elijah's face. He could barely breathe as her words sank deep into his soul. "I've lived a long life, and I'm proud of every single moment that led to you. If this is how my story ends, then let it end with you doing what's right. Don't you dare give up. Not now. Not when the world needs your voice." The video cut off, but her voice lingered like an echo in his heart. Elijah stood slowly, eyes burning with resolve. "They thought this would stop me," he said quietly, "but it just made me more certain." Emma stepped forward. "Then we fight harder. For her. For all of them." Elijah nodded. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. Grief had become fire. Love had become armor. He turned toward the wall where their evidence board hung, strings stretching from photo to file like veins across a beating heart. He stared at the image of a masked man, the one they believed was a high-ranking member of the Alliance. "We find them," Elijah said. "We take them down. and we make sure no one else ever has to choose between justice and the people they love. Because some battles aren't fought only with facts and law, but with the strength of a promise whispered through generations, and the voice of a grandmother who believed that truth, even in chains, still had the power to set the world free. The night before the rescue, Elijah barely slept. The plan he and Emma had crafted was risky. Too risky, some might say. But there was no time left to hesitate. Grandma Ruth's life hung in the balance, and so did the truth. And Elijah had made peace with one thing. If he was going to go down, it would be while standing up. Their intel was thin, but just enough. An abandoned printing factory on the city's outskirts, recently bought through a shell company tied to a known Alliance affiliate. It had no cameras, no activity during the day, but was heavily guarded at night. And inside, according to intercepted chatter, was where they were holding her. Elijah stared out of the van window as they approached the location. His heart pounded like a drum. Emma, sitting beside him, handed him a small earpiece and whispered, "Once we're in, I'll create the distraction. You get to your grandmother. Whatever happens, Elijah, don't stop until it's done." He looked at her, his voice low but firm. "I won't." The factory loomed ahead, dark and silent, its metal walls rusted, its windows blackened with years of neglect. But inside those walls, truth was being held hostage, and Elijah was ready to break it free. They moved like shadows. Emma slipped into the utility panel outside and with precise fingers cut the perimeter alarms. The guards barely had time to react before a loud bang echoed from the east wing, Emma's diversion. Lights flared, men scattered, and in the chaos, Elijah slipped inside. He found her. Tied to a chair, her hands trembling but her eyes still fierce. "Grandma Ruth, baby," she gasped. "Elijah, I'm here," he whispered, voice tight with emotion. "I'm getting you out." But before he could cut the rope, a heavy voice echoed behind him. Well, I knew you'd come." Elijah froze. He turned slowly, his fists clenched, his body tense. Officer Mason, dressed in plain clothes but wearing the same crooked grin he'd worn the day he ticketed Elijah. Only this time, there was no badge, just power, raw and unchecked. "You really think this ends with you? That your little speeches and truth bombs can bring down what we've built?" Mason stepped forward, voice calm, cruel. "You're smart, boy, I'll give you that, but not smart enough to know when to quit." Elijah stepped between Mason and his grandmother, his voice low and unwavering. "You're right, I am smart. Smart enough to know who you really are. Smart enough to expose everything you've done, everything you're hiding." Mason laughed, condescending and cold. "Expose? With what? You're a kid. Nobody's gonna listen to you." But Elijah smiled, just slightly. "Funny. That's what they said about me in court, until the judge started listening." From his pocket, Elijah pulled a tiny pen recorder, still running. "Every word you just said, it's already uploaded. And that backup generator your men forgot about? It's been feeding power to a hidden line this whole time." Mason's grin vanished. Elijah stepped forward. "You kidnapped my grandmother. You tampered with evidence. You tried to silence the truth. And now the whole city's going to hear what justice really sounds like." Mason lunged. But before he could reach Elijah, a loud crack echoed as Emma burst through the side door, wielding a makeshift baton. Mason stumbled, then fell, groaning in rage. "I told you not to stop," she shouted breathlessly. Elijah rushed back to Ruth, cutting her ropes. She fell into his arms, shaking but alive. "You okay?" he asked. "I am now, sugar," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Sirens wailed in the distance. Emma had triggered the final part of their plan, alerting a trusted journalist and a local civil rights attorney. Reinforcements were coming, and with them the spotlight the Alliance had always feared. Later that night, as Elijah stood beneath the streetlight outside the factory, his clothes stained with dust and sweat, he watched as Officer Mason was dragged into a squad car, shouting threats that no longer held power. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, but Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to, because the truth had already spoken, and for the first time, it had been heard. In that moment, standing tall beside Emma and his grandmother, Elijah understood the true meaning of courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight through it for something greater. He had stood toe-to-toe with corruption and won, not with fists, but with facts, not with hate, but with hope. And in doing so, he proved a truth that would echo long after the headlines faded. No one is too young. No one is too small. And no lie is strong enough to stand against a voice brave enough to speak. The courtroom was packed. Press, reporters, community leaders, and ordinary people who had followed every moment of Elijah's extraordinary fight. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the entire city held its breath. Officer Mason stood at the defendant's table, this time not with a badge on his chest, but handcuffs around his wrists. His face, once smug with authority, was pale and drawn. As the prosecution played the recording, his own words threatening Elijah, mocking the law, he looked away, jaw clenched. Elijah sat in the front row, quiet, still, his grandmother's hand gently resting over his. Emma sat beside him, chin lifted with quiet pride. The verdict didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. The gavel fell, and with it a silence broke into thunderous applause. But Elijah didn't smile. His victory wasn't about revenge. It was about truth being heard, finally, without fear. And it wasn't just Mason. Over the following weeks, more arrests followed. Files Elijah and Emma had helped uncover, hidden documents, internal memos, secret communications, led to grand jury indictments across the country. Judges who once ruled in favor of the alliance resigned in disgrace. Officers who abused their power were stripped of their badges. One by one, the pieces of the dark machine began to fall. What had started as a single false charge against a boy riding home from school became the spark that lit a movement. But through it all, Elijah remained grounded. He refused interview requests from national networks. He turned down speaking tours, book deals, and even a scholarship offered by a prestigious private academy. Instead, when he was finally invited to speak at a community rally in front of Pineview's courthouse, Elijah stood on a small wooden stage, holding a worn-out folder of handwritten notes, and looked out at the crowd, not as a hero, but as a witness. "I didn't do this for fame," he began, voice calm and steady. "I didn't fight because I wanted attention. I fought because I was tired of being silent. Tired of watching people like my mother be erased. Tired of seeing people like my grandmother disrespected. Tired of a system that only listens when you shout loud enough to shake its walls." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces below. Black, white, old, young, every walk of life. "I'm not special," he said. "I just believed that the truth still mattered, and I still believe that no one is too young or too powerless or too small to speak it." Applause rippled through the crowd. But Elijah wasn't finished. "This wasn't just my fight. It was yours. It was ours. And justice, real justice, doesn't end in a courtroom. It begins with how we treat each other when the cameras are gone." He stepped back, folded his notes, and walked down the steps. No bodyguards, no entourage, just his mother and grandmother waiting with open arms. And Emma smiling quietly, already knowing he'd say no to the spotlight. Later that evening, Elijah sat on the porch of Grandma Ruth's home, the sun setting in streaks of gold and lavender. He watched kids playing in the street. He listened to laughter echo from an open window. Peace, at last, wasn't just an idea. It was real. Fragile? Maybe. Imperfect? Definitely. But real. Grandma Ruth handed him a warm cup of tea. "You did good, baby." He looked down into the steam rising from the cup, then up at her. "We did it," he said simply, because he knew this victory didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to the ones who never got the chance to speak, to the mothers who waited years for answers, to the children who learned early how to survive in silence, to anyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter. Justice had spoken, and it spoke in the voice of a 15-year-old boy who refused to be ignored. And now, the world was listening. The days that followed were slow and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. The news cycle had moved on. The crowds were gone. The city had begun to breathe again. But for Elijah, the silence wasn't empty, it was full. Full of healing, full of love, full of something deeper than victory. Home had never felt more like home. Sarah was back, not just in body, but in presence. She and Grandma Ruth spent long evenings together, cooking, laughing softly in the kitchen, rebuilding a bond they thought they'd lost forever. And Elijah finally allowed himself to rest. No speeches. No plans, just the rhythm of a life returning. One crisp evening, golden light spilled through the window of their modest kitchen. The scent of cinnamon and warm pastry filled the air. Grandma Ruth pulled a tray of sweet rolls from the oven, her hands steady, her eyes twinkling with pride. Elijah sat at the table, notebook closed for once, fingers wrapped around a warm mug of cocoa. He looked up and smiled as Sarah joined them, placing a bowl of fresh fruit in the center of the table. It was a simple moment, but it was everything. He looked around the room, at the woman who gave him life, and the woman who raised him to fight for it, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt safe. Not because the world had changed overnight, not because justice had magically fixed itself, but because something had shifted inside him. Because now Elijah knew the truth. The world didn't need perfect heroes. It needed people who refused to give up, who stood up again and again, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Grandma Ruth sat down beside him, brushing a crumb from his sleeve. "You've come a long way, baby," she said, her voice soft. "But I got a feeling your journey's just beginning." Elijah nodded slowly, eyes distant but steady. "I know," he whispered. He looked out the window, where the sun dipped low over Pineview, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. A boy passed by on a bike, maybe 10 years old, his backpack flapping behind him, free and full of promise. Elijah smiled. Then he turned back to Ruth and said the words that had been building in his chest for days. "Justice is a long road, Grandma, but I won't stop walking it. Not for a single day." Ruth reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "And when you get tired," she said with a warm smile, "you rest a while, but then you keep going." The three of them sat in the quiet hum of evening light, laughter rising softly between them, the scent of baked sugar floating through the air. No banners, no cameras, no crowds. Just a kitchen, a family, a future. And in that moment, Elijah Carter, just a boy from Pineview with a voice that refused to be silenced, knew exactly who he was. He was ready. Ready for whatever came next. Because justice didn't end in courtrooms or headlines. It lived in every step forward. And Elijah, he had only just begun. If this story moved you even a little, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss more powerful stories like this. Your support means the world to us. It's what keeps our team inspired to create meaningful content that uplifts, educates, and connects. Thank you for listening, and thank you for believing in stories that matter.